Even if you only know Cyberpunk 2077 or Cyberpunk Edgerunners, you probably know 77 was based on a tabletop role-playing series that created the actual setting that they're using now for the video game. Cyberpunk RED is the latest version of the original Cyberpunk role-playing game, and Cyberpunk RED is supposed to be the bridge between Cyberpunk 2077 and Cyberpunk 2020. RED takes place in 2045, and it's supposed to tie the original Cyberpunk tabletop series to the video game and to all its different spin-offs so that all these different projects can be part of the same canon. So that all these things can be part of the same continuity with one timeline in one shared Cyberpunk universe. The original tabletop series started all the way back in the 1980s with Cyberpunk 2013, which turned into Cyberpunk 2020 and ran for around a decade until Arasaka Games ended the publications back in 1997. This was when the original Cyberpunk metaplot with all the different characters and all the different stories finally ended with the fourth corporate war between Militech and Arasaka set in 2023. So when CDPR and Arasaka came up with a deal for a Cyberpunk video game set in 2077, they had to update the rest of the franchise so they could set up or try and make way for things they wanted to do in 2077. In between, Arasaka did try and take the setting past the 2020s with Cyberpunk v3 and Cybergeneration, but neither of these ever came close to the success they had with the original, so both of these were abandoned pretty early on and neither of these are considered canon. Some of the material in these were reused in RED, but CDPR and Arasaka actually wrote and developed RED and 77 side by side from the ground up just to make sure as much of the material lined up as they possibly could. There's obviously going to be one or two plot holes they might have missed, or just little things they went and tweaked around from the originals, but writers from both teams openly collaborated and wrote together to fill in all the backstory and to update all the lore so that RED would build up to 77, and so that 77, RED, and the originals were as consistent and continuous with each other as they could make them. So many things in Cyberpunk RED were written just to make room for things you see in 77. From all the little changes in all the different gangs and corporations or all the different neighborhoods around Night City, there's honestly too many things to really list. But this is why you keep seeing stuff in RED like the net being rebuilt in bits and pieces that aren't completely connected to each other, or like Alt Cunningham starting up an entire ghost network of people who were soul killed in the old net, or like Netwatch making a deal with Alt to build something that people in RED were calling the Black Wall. But one of the more subtle things they were setting up with Cyberpunk RED was all the build up to one of the most interesting parts of the backstory behind Cyberpunk 2077. RED added a bunch of lore and a bunch of new material as a prelude to the Unification War across the new United States, which turned into a new covert war between Militech and Arasaka. I've always thought the story with the Unification War was one of the best parts of the backstory behind the entire video game. It's one of the most developed pieces of lore that actually launches off some of the most interesting stories in present-day Cyberpunk. Everything from Militech being nationalized by the American government and Arasaka being forced out of America for the next 50-something years after the nuclear bomb destroyed half of Night City was actually a brilliant way of resetting the clock in the Cyberpunk universe. But aside from what all this does for 77, I've always thought this opened a lot of doors for a lot of interesting things they could do in Cyberpunk RED. 77 has this whole elaborate backstory with Rosalind Myers and with Militech, but there's already another character in Cyberpunk RED who's been around since 2020 who could have very well had an even larger role in all of this, who could have been a major player making waves and causing trouble all throughout the 2040s and 2050s way before the Unification War even started. In 2077, Rosalind Myers is supposed to be the president of the new United States, but in Phantom Liberty, Myers actually mentions the previous president, Elizabeth Kress, and Myers tells us Kress had basically been in office for somewhere close to 50 years before she was finally elected out. And Elizabeth Kress is a character that's been referenced as the American president in Cyberpunk going back to the 1990s. She's actually been in the franchise ever since Cyberpunk 2020, but she usually just had almost nothing to do with the actual stories or the metaplot overall. The character write-up they gave her in Home of the Brave said she was supposed to be a colonel from the original United States Air Force, who was famous for taking emergency control of NORAD and then single-handedly rebuilding its entire command after most of its leaders were killed in a bombing by the Euros and the Neo-Soviet Union. And then afterwards she used this fame to launch herself into politics, where she eventually became president of the new United States. So she's clearly a character the writers put a decent amount of thought behind from the start. And in tabletop terms, she actually had a surprisingly impressive character sheet that even put Johnny Silverhands to shame in terms of attributes and skills for some reason. But all that aside, she was always such a minor character that we've never even seen so much as a drawing of her in the tabletop books. But now in Cyberpunk RED, it looks like that might actually be changing. As of now, they've actually already started using Kress in their lore and in the backstory for RED way more than they ever did in 2020. They've already made her a major part of the backstory that's supposed to bridge the gap between 2020 and RED, but the way they've done this actually puts her right in the middle of the story for the Unification War that's supposed to come later for Cyberpunk 2077. And looking at some of the things they've written in Cyberpunk RED, I've always thought this entire civil war between the government and the Free States could have actually started with Kress during the 2040s in RED. I've always thought Elizabeth Kress might have actually been waging her own secret war against all the different Free States all on her own before Rosalind Myers was ever even elected. This isn't anything that's mentioned or directly suggested, it's just my own theory and my idea for something they could do in Cyberpunk RED. But as it stands, there's actually already a lot of material in the tabletop books that would actually make something like this more than plausible. And when you look at all the 2077 lore on the Unification War, this would actually make for a perfect tie-in between RED and 77. If you've only played 2077, some of this gets brought up and kind of glossed over, and the rest of it just wasn't really relevant to 77. But the general backstory behind Cyberpunk goes that by 1989, the original United States allowed the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, and the DEA to become so powerful and corrupt they actually banded together and took control of most of the US government behind the scenes without anyone knowing. They had so much power or so much influence that they ended up starting feuds and full-blown wars with foreign powers that eventually started bankrupting and crippling the entire United States. Eventually, they actually started manipulating the stock markets all throughout Asia and throughout Europe on such a large scale that they got caught. Cyberpunk 2020 even said they went as far as hacking the stock exchanges in Asia and in Europe, but either way, the rest of the world found out and started sanctioning America into oblivion. All of this pushed the US to the brink, but revealing they were doing this to the world's stock markets ended up compromising the entire world's financial system so badly it ended up causing a world stock crash that destroyed or crippled entire economies all around the globe. All of this caused the collapse of the entire US government, which caused the entire country to spiral into chaos. The country eventually reformed as the new United States, but after the collapse, several states had gotten so used to governing themselves that they decided they wanted nothing more to do with a corrupt and ineffective federal government and declared independence. All of this is supposed to be why corporations started becoming more powerful than governments, and it's also why there are free states all around the NUSA. The rest of the country is supposed to be controlled by a new federal government centered mostly on the East Coast, which controls everything east of the Mississippi River and a few states in the Midwest. The free states all govern themselves, collect their own taxes, and even have their own militaries, but they still try to maintain a cordial relationship with the rest of the NUSA, and collectively they even play a role in the NUS government. 2020 says the free states are supposed to have a seat on the Regional Committee, which is supposed to be the new United States' version of American Congress, but overall there were always supposed to be some tensions between the two sides. Only the states that were large enough and wealthy enough to sustain themselves became free states, so the rest of the country was effectively cut off from huge sources of tax revenue that could have been used to rebuild other places around the country. And because they're all effectively their own countries, it's almost impossible for them to agree on just about anything, so just deciding who gets that seat on that committee takes them forever. And on top of this, some of the free states are apparently outright hostile to each other to the point where it's a real concern for the rest of the new United States. But the conflict between the free states and the NUS federal government is actually one of the ways that Cyberpunk RED started laying the groundwork for 77. And this is where I think Elizabeth Kress could have a larger role to play in all of this. If we only looked at Cyberpunk 2020, the problems between the free states and the government still seem pretty minor, and they didn't really get that much attention in any of the stories. But if you look at Cyberpunk RED, the writers actually started adding things and creating more and more conflict. They added more and more to the overall lore and to the backstory leading into Cyberpunk RED that actually justified and made it more believable that there'd eventually be a full-blown civil war by 2069. Things that were never mentioned once in all of 2020, or just things that are supposed to have happened later. and they've actually given Elizabeth Kress a much larger role in all of this than she ever had before. The first thing that really stands out is Red changing the lore to tell us the old American government actually fought full-blown secession wars against the Free States on US soil. In the original Cyberpunk, the Free States started seceding after the original government collapsed, and they had so much economic power that the new government couldn't really do anything to stop them. 2020 said this was supposed to be very political and non-violent because the old government wanted to avoid a civil war. But in Cyberpunk RED, they've completely changed the story so that the American military had actually fought against the Free States in America before. But now in Cyberpunk RED, they've actually given the NUS government much bigger reasons to have problems with the Free States than they ever did before. RED expands the story of the Fourth Corporate War from the 2020s for part of its backstory, and according to RED, when Arasaka and Militech were destroying entire towns and cities all across America, the government had the power to intervene. But when they tried deploying their soldiers to put a stop to the corporate fighting, a lot of the Free States wouldn't allow the federal military through their territories. This was supposed to be the cyberpunk equivalent of World War III, where corporations were leveling entire cities all around the world. And even while they were waging war in America, the government couldn't even properly deploy the actual military because Free States just kept getting in their way and trying to stop them while the country was burning down. And on top of this, after the war, some of the most powerful Free States around banded together into something called the Pacifica Confederation just so they could keep control of the West Coast and stand against the NUS government. Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and North California were already supposed to be the wealthiest Free States around, but to make things worse, all of the NUS government's national military stationed in the Pacific Northwest just turned around and defected from the government and started working for the Pacifica Confederation. The Confederation uses the government's ordnance and their soldiers to keep other federal forces out of their land, and they're using them to leverage better deals with corporations to secure more power for themselves, meaning they're basically using the government's own military to secure themselves more power and autonomy from the government. So not only did they contribute to the destruction of America during the war, but a bunch of Free States actually hijacked part of the government's national military and started using it against the federal government. And all of this is why Elizabeth Kress has all but openly declared war on all the Free States and the rest of Cyberpunk RED. RED says that she actually declared a state of emergency after the war and straight up suspended democratic federal elections because she thought the Free States were jeopardizing all of America. We know she stayed in office well into the 2060s for somewhere close to 50 years, and in RED she openly declared she wasn't allowing any federal elections until the government finally had a binding treaty with the Free States once and for all. RED tells us she turned the entire NUSA into a functional dictatorship, and she refused to lift the state of emergency until she finally got the Free States under control. All of this shows just how bad things really got, and just how far Elizabeth Kress was willing to go. It shows how badly she wanted the Free States out of the way once and for all, and I think this is one of the most interesting parts of the lore, because I've always thought this was something they could use to set up some very interesting stories in Cyberpunk RED. As it stands, there's actually already something in the tabletop book that's always given me this theory Elizabeth Kress could have actually been doing a whole lot more behind the scenes to try and bring down all the Free States the entire time she was president. Kress could have actually been waging a covert war against the Free States way before the 2070s and the Unification War ever even started. Again, this is obviously just me speculating. It's not mentioned or suggested directly anywhere in RED or 77. This has always just been something I've wanted to see in Cyberpunk RED. But there's actually already something in the tabletop book that could already open the door to all of this if the writers ever wanted to go this direction. And when you look at all the lore behind the Unification War in Cyberpunk 2077, a lot of things would actually line up fairly well with this idea. When you make a character in the role-playing game, there's lots of different options for different backstories, and one of the things you can do is have that character sell out to larger organizations who can pay for extra cyberware in exchange for having that character doing their dirty work for them. Taking up a life of organized crime, selling out to a corporation, or joining the covert military were all options back in Cyberpunk 2020 and even Cyberpunk 2013. But in Cyberpunk RED, this section about the covert military actually gives us lore on Elizabeth Kress and what she was doing by 2045. The 2020 version just talked about having a tabletop character who was a government Black Ops soldier, but the Red version makes a point of telling us how even though the war was over, there were still a bunch of dangerous enemies lurking around the world and actively threatening what was left of America. It tells us that in the 2040s, Elizabeth Kress was secretly using the new American military against anyone who might have been working with Arasaka and endangering the new United States. The book talks about low-key national armies running around all over the backwaters of the world, and the tabletop games always imply these covert military operations are happening in other parts of the world, but with everything they've introduced in Cyberpunk RED, I've always thought a perfect way to create new story hooks would be to use this to expand on this whole conflict between the government and the Free States. If Kress is really secretly sending Black Ops soldiers to fight covert proxy wars and to destabilize foreign countries because they're threatening America, then there's really nothing that would stop her from doing the same thing to all the Free States that keep standing in her way on American soil. If Talsorian or CDPR or even just tabletop players wanted to do stories like this, then the groundwork is clearly already there. Elizabeth Kress is already supposed to be the president that turned the entire NUSA into a functional dictatorship, and we can clearly see Cyberpunk RED is already confirming she does run illegal, covert military operations against America's enemies. And she's been doing this since Cyberpunk 2020 for at least 25 years by Cyberpunk RED. So clearly there aren't many laws or many restrictions she won't cross in the name of securing NUS interests. And when you look at how she's described as a character, this would only make more sense. If you look back at that character write-up, Elizabeth Kress was supposed to be a military commander who was coming up in the time that the United States was breaking down all around her. And even though she nearly died after being blown up, she took control of NORAD and single-handedly turned it around while it was falling apart all by herself. She's supposed to be a take-charge leader who's been taking matters into her own hands her whole career. All of this is emphasized again in Cyberpunk RED, and RED already makes a point of telling us she's tough enough to face down any threat to US sovereignty. So given how much damage the Free States have already done to the new United States and Kress's history, I think it's pretty clear this isn't something she would put past her at the very least. First off, as it stands, everything Kress says or does in Cyberpunk RED actually already ties in pretty well with all the lore behind the Unification War in '77. Kress said she wanted a treaty between the Free States and the NUSA, and 77 says a treaty actually does happen in 2070 when the war ended. And even though Kress said she wanted guarantees and agreements with the Free States, this quote here from Cyberpunk RED clearly shows what she really wanted was to reunite the country under one banner. So before Rosalind Myers ever took office and declared war, Elizabeth Kress was already talking about having a country again and bringing back the United States. And then there's the fact that Kress was the one who actually nationalized Militech and pit the new United States against Arasaka in the first place by the time the Unification War actually happens. So basically, everything that happens in the Unification War already ties back to things that Kress was doing in Cyberpunk RED. But more importantly, there's another reason why this covert war in Cyberpunk RED would actually tie in pretty well with what we see in 77. If we look at that segment in RED about Elizabeth Kress and covert military action, this would actually give a lot more meaning to Kress's whole crusade or Arasaka destroying America. If you read this book, it seems like this just kind of comes out of nowhere. Because before this, there was never any mention anywhere else in the entire book about Arasaka conspiring with other countries or other groups to destroy America. The writers were probably keeping this as ambiguous as possible so that players and GMs could try and turn this into any kind of story hook they wanted in their own tabletop campaigns. But if you look at all the lore about the Unification War in 77, then this would also tie in perfectly, and it would actually explain a lot of the things they tell us in 2077. The war is supposed to kick off when Rosalind Myers starts invading Free State territories in 2069, but even though she had the federal government's and the Militech Corporation's combined militaries behind her, it still took them more than a year just to push their way across the country. But 2077 says the reason that the Free States could hold them off so long to begin with was that Arasaka was secretly supplying all their militias with cutting-edge weapons, and security advisors were helping them fight off the government and Militech all across the entire country the entire time. But one of the major story points in RED and 77 was that after the Fourth Corporate War, Arasaka was kicked out of America for the next 47 years. All their corporate property in America was seized by the NUS government, and they were banned from doing business or from being in America until they basically went and strong-armed their way back in at the end of the Unification War. So from 2023 to 2070, Arasaka wasn't supposed to have any real presence in America at all. But yet the story says by 2069 they had the connections and the infrastructure to suddenly arm an entire civil war across America, and it says they did it in secret for more than a whole year. So obviously somewhere in that time in between there had to have been some kind of relationship between the Free States and Arasaka. So I don't think it would be so far-fetched if the writers went backwards and started using this for things that were happening in Cyberpunk RED. RED would have only been 20 years earlier, so it would hardly be a stretch to think some kind of conspiracy this complicated wasn't already in the works back then. And if you look at how Cyberpunk RED goes and describes Arasaka, this would also line up fairly well with this whole idea. RED already says that even though Arasaka is supposed to be a shell of what they used to be and that all their corporate property's been limited to Japan, they're still licensing their agents and their mercenaries to people all around the world under everyone's noses. The direct quote says that Arasaka troops are covertly licensed out to other firms around the world, but they're just wearing different uniforms and hiding the fact they're working for Arasaka. So this right here already shows Arasaka was doing the exact same thing they were doing in 2069 all the way back in 2045. They already had a way of getting around America's ban even while Kress was trying to keep them out of America. And they were already secretly sending out their troops and their security advisors all around the world despite the fact that most of the world hated them for essentially causing World War III. So given that the Kress administration is supposed to be Arasaka's #1 enemy in the 2040s, then what better way would there be to weaken the NUS federal government as much as possible than by supplying all the dissidents and separatists they could around the country? It would clearly be a very conceivable story to have Arasaka colluding with the Free States back in RED, meaning Kress would have even more reason to run her covert operations against the Free States. And there's actually even more the writers could do if they ever wanted to do something like this. Because as it stands, Cyberpunk RED already goes out of its way to show us political tensions all across the new United States were higher than ever by 2045. The entire backstory they wrote for RED tells us that after 2020, the NUS federal government was feeling more and more threatened by virtually everybody. Entire factions and confederations that used to be pretty small and insignificant or just plain didn't exist in 2020 have risen up and started challenging the NUS government all around the country and the world. I already mentioned how the Pacifica Confederation hijacked part of the NUS government's military and started using it against them, but RED also says the exact same thing pretty much happened up in space. The High Riders used the Fourth Corporate War to suddenly declare independence and literally became the High Rider Confederation. All the people who worked and lived up in space basically turned around and announced that they were turning their backs on every single government back on Earth, and they were keeping all the government-funded assets and technology for themselves. And they did this by using something in Cyberpunk called mass drivers to hurl space rocks down on Earth and ended up leveling the entire cities of Tampa and Colorado Springs. So basically, the NUSA ended up losing most of the power and control they had up in space, and an entire group of people they helped fund turned around and used their weapons to destroy entire American cities. And the High Riders are still threatening the governments with these mass drivers to make sure they're left alone. Then there are the Drift Nations, which are basically supposed to be floating cities living out on the ocean. A lot of these cities are right off the coast to the NUSA. Ever since 2020, a lot of these are completely run by nomads who've almost always openly defied the NUS government and refused to live by any sort of united federal rule. But RED says that after the Fourth Corporate War, a lot of these cities suddenly became some of the largest, most important centers of trade throughout the world. So not only are these Drift Nations essentially entire outlaw communities, but they've actually become a sort of economic power that makes them even harder to control than ever before. They're right off on the coast competing with the NUS government while openly defying the NUS government. So circling back, it would only make sense that Kress might actually be desperate enough to wage a covert war against the Free States in America when this was supposed to be the situation she was dealing with in the 2040s. Her government was facing pressure and open defiance all around the world, and then on top of that, the separatist states that inadvertently let more of America get destroyed during the war are challenging her all throughout the country on home soil. Not only would launching covert military operations against the Free States be the only viable way for her to gain some sort of control, but I even think that whole idea of Kress using covert military forces could actually be used for a whole lot more. I'd love to see what else our Talsorian could do with the Drift Nations, or the High Riders, or the Deep Down colonies, and I also think one of the most interesting things they could do in Cyberpunk RED would be to focus more on characters like Kress and all the major things that were changing all throughout the Cyberpunk universe. But all in all, that pretty much wraps it all up. I hope all of this was at least mostly coherent. I feel like this one was kind of all over the place. But to sum it all up, I've always thought one of the things that Cyberpunk RED could do with Elizabeth Kress and the NUS government was to have her be embroiled in a low-key secret war against the Free States and Arasaka so they could tie this in with 2077 and its stories about the Unification War. Not only is the lore in Cyberpunk RED already going out of its way to amp up the conflict between the NUS government and the Free States, but this would actually be a very fitting bridge between the 2040s and the 2070s in the franchise. I can't remember the last time I did a Cyberpunk tabletop theory. I'm pretty sure it was 2 or 3 years ago now, and obviously this is all just my own theory or my own idea. This isn't the only explanation for how any of this lore or these stories tie together, but after I played the video game, this has always just been my idea for a story or for a tabletop campaign or something like that in Cyberpunk RED. Like, imagine a chronicle in Cyberpunk RED where all the characters end up leaving Night City for a job that takes them out to one of the free states like Arizona. Something as simple as being hired to hijack a weapons convoy could end up putting the entire party in the middle of a giant conspiracy where they find out that the Kress administration was secretly trying to overthrow the Free State government of Arizona. You could easily work in characters from the government and characters who are covert government cyber soldiers who start hunting down the player characters all across the state. And suddenly the entire party could have a chance to try and put a stop to the entire scheme, or they could try and find some way to cash in and then just tell the people of Arizona to eat dirt. I don't know, maybe that sounds ridiculous. Or maybe if you've only seen 2077 or Cyberpunk Edgerunners, you might think that sounds wrong for Cyberpunk or something like that. But you might be surprised to hear that 77 and Edgerunners are honestly the outliers in this franchise. Both of those were written with two very different narrative perspectives in the overall Cyberpunk universe than anything you'd find in the original Cyberpunk tabletop franchise. In a lot of ways, most of the stories you'd find in the original tabletop books were a lot more sanitized and a lot more black and white than most of what we saw in the video game or the anime. Most of the characters were still outlaws, but they were also a lot more idealistic than the ones we see in the game or in the anime. And a story like this was exactly the kind of story our Talsorian used to write and sell as a tabletop adventure all the time. This is just what I can think of for one story, but there's easily a ton of different things that you could do with a story hook like this. But like always, if someone's watching this, then feel free to tell me what you think down in the comments. If you think this theory is ridiculous, then go ahead and tell me. I'd love to hear why. Thanks to anyone watching, as always. Take care.